Welcome to Reaction. I'm Executive Editor Maggie Pagano, and with me today is the distinguished European commentator Wolfgang Munchau, who used to write for the FT and now runs his own brilliant newsletter called Eurointelligence. And Wolfgang is here because he wrote a rather extraordinary article this week, which caught my eye, which said that Angela Merkel, who many people in the West think is probably the greatest political leader of the last 20 years, he said that she was probably the most overrated politician in the world. Now, Wolfgang, that's quite a statement. Would you like to talk us through it?
Yes, Maggie, thanks for inviting me. I have to maybe qualify this. I mean, the world is a large place, so certainly the most overrated politician in Europe right now. Yeah. That's for sure. We might. There may be other world leaders who might fall into a similar category, but she's been around for a long time. She's been in power for 16 years, like Helmut Kohl before her. And she's been hailed by some people as the leader of the Western world, which I always thought was a bad description of what she does. And also something she probably wouldn't agree with herself. What she has been good at was to position herself in the German domestic political spectrum so that it was impossible to build any coalition without her. She had an excuse sense of the center of gravity in German politics, and that is a skill that's she's second to none. I don't want to disqualify her or diss her in any way. She's an extremely skillful politician with an acute sense of power. The statement I made referred to her leadership on a European level. She is not a European leader. She is somebody who defends German interests or defends what she defines as German interests. And these are mostly commercial interests. Germany is an export industrial nation. It exports to China, it exports to Russia. It's dependent on Russia for gas and oil. It's dependent on China for its exports and its investments. So Germany is maintaining very good relationships with those regimes, and is sort of practical German politics ignores human rights. They talk about it all the time, but in practice, this isn't a factor. German politics is ultimately about it's about money, and she's been she's a mercantilist in that respect. It's all about trade. And that's what she did. It's now no longer working on a European level. Previously, Europe followed her because Germany was a big country, but now she is trying to go an extra step, and people are now balking at it. Maybe they're balking at it because she has kind of entered the lame duck phase. She'll be out soon. There's no need to be. You're not going to get anything back by being nice to her. You'll have to deal with her successor now. That's now becoming obvious to everybody.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about her successor in a moment, but you mentioned a couple of very big strategic errors that she's made during her time, which was brought to light last week with the fact that so many people are unhappy that Biden met President Putin first and not European leaders. And I think your sense was that actually, it should have been the EU that he met first. And you talked about, obviously, those domestic issues, nuclear energy, which has made her so dependent on Russia for energy with Nord Stream, the refugees, but also Eurobonds. And you made a very interesting point, Wolfgang, where you said that people think with a recovery plan that actually maybe Germany will be leading some sort of fiscal union, but you don't think that's the case. Can you just talk us through some of those?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the Putin issue, because that's sort of where the big row happened last week. She had a meeting with Macron. They were both irked by the fact that Biden gets to talk to Putin, and everybody looks at Biden and Putin, and they were not at the table. And for her to having to ask Biden what Putin is thinking is a complete embarrassment. And they obviously said, look, we have to, because we are G7 countries. We have to talk to Putin. We have to be on in those discussions. And she basically, the EU decided in 2014, I think, or 2013, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, that they stop all high-level contacts with Putin. I mean, there still have been operational diplomacy, but not this high-level diplomacy has kind of been suspended. And Merkel and Macron proposed that the EU should resume high-level diplomacy contacts with Russia, and the Baltic states said, look, I mean, this is absolutely a no-no, because we have, Russia hasn't changed its behavior. On the contrary, what we've seen with Navalny, they poisoned an opposition. They're still active in the eastern parts of Ukraine. They are now pursuing political union with Belarus, with a possibility that this might end up in annexation over a period of time. So, Russia is as aggressive as ever. The Baltics have a huge issue. You mentioned Nord Stream 2. This is a huge issue for the Baltics and Poland and Ukraine, because this is Germany and Russia basically treating those countries as some as sort of in between territories between Russia and Germany, and trying to bypass them. And that sort of raises the worst memories for these countries of the Second World War and the period preceding it. And while nobody is accusing Germany of any sort of power games in the way that Germany, it's not like the Third Reich kind of debate, but it is certainly it's certainly a diplomacy that has evoked all the wrong memories for them, and they basically said, no, we're not following you on this. And there's also this parallel debate about having majority voting in foreign policy, and I think a lot of people are now reminded, if we had foreign policy majority in foreign policy, Germany and France would have outvoted us, and there would have been a qualified majority, and the Baltic states, all they now have left is their veto and their kind of the solidarity between themselves, and Poland and Romania was on their side too. So they're sort of a group of countries, there were 7 altogether, that resisted Merkel's and Macron's power grab, basically, or foreign policy. And that's an unusual thing. That's normally didn't happen. She came back and she was quite shaken. She said, I mean, this is very disappointing. The EU doesn't always reach agreement on this, but this is sort of a very personal thing she wanted done sort of in the final, in what might be her last big European Council. I mean, she might hang on for a little while if there is no coalition deal, but she's kind of, her sort of active policy years are over now. This is sort of the final time of her ordinary term in office, where she has her own political majority. That's kind of ending now. And she's lost that. She also lost this other battle to do with the UK, which is about the banning UK tourists entering Europe. I mean, she has been unusually outspoken, saying we should not let any Brits into Europe. They have to go for 2 weeks of quarantine, which kind of is not particularly conducive for holiday makers, even if they're vaccinated. So that means that kind of basically kills the holidays. And some have said, okay, but we'll do it for vaccinations, for people who are vaccinated. Spain has said, no, we're not doing this at all, but we do require tests. Tests is okay. People can, when they travel, these days they have to travel anyway, they have to have a test when they travel. The airlines are demanding it anyways. But so Spain is still on, but there is now a big attempt going on in Brussels to give a blanket, to produce a blanket ban for British tourists this summer.
Why do you think Wolfgang, sorry to interrupt, why do you think she took such a hard line?
Oh, this is purely domestic. There's an election going on in September. Germany messed up the vaccination policy. They haven't got, I mean, they've caught up a little bit, but it's still only 35% of the people to have received 2 vaccines. We know that it takes 2 vaccines to be protected, moderately protected against the Delta variant. You will still get sick, but you will not die, most likely not die from it. So Germany has cleared a long way away from any level that could be classified as herd immunity. Even the UK is away from that, and with a 50% vaccination rate, but at least a 50% vaccination rate is closer to that goal. And by the end of the summer, it will be a 60%, and then we are very close to the goal. So the UK is edging towards this goal where a sufficient number of people are protected. While Germany is still quite a distance away from it. And if the Delta variant becomes a dominant, people will remember the mistakes the German government has made. I mean, every government has made mistakes, so this is not a particular one, but the big mistake that she made and her government made was to let the EU, give the EU the responsibility to buy the vaccines. That was the reason which caused all these delays, and it's the original sin of their policies, basically.
So tell us what you think the outcome of September's election might well be. We've got two potential, Armin Laschet, and even Markus Söder is not out of the game yet, is he? Can you?
Oh yes, he is. Oh yes, Markus Söder is out of the game.
Oh, okay.
They had the fight. He lost the fight. He in the end, the CDU put its foot down. It's the bigger of the two parties. You cannot nominate a chancellor candidate against the bigger party. Söder didn't. The Bavarians could have broken off. They could have done that, but they didn't do that. They didn't have a majority, and that probably wouldn't have worked for them. It would have been too aggressive a move for him to force the issue any further. He went as far as possible. He had hoped for the CDU itself to be rebellious. That didn't happen. So there was a 3-week period in which that rebellion would have taken place if it had taken place, and it didn't take place, or it took place not to a sufficient degree to this. So Laschet is the guy. He's the premier of North Rhine-Westphalia, kind of an old-fashioned politician. He's as close as you can come in Germany to being a climate change denier. He has just commissioned, as Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, commissioned a coal-fired power station. Wow. Whenever he talks about climate change, he says he acknowledges its existence, but it's always a yes, but. Yes, it's a problem, but we have bigger problems. It's that kind of mentality, and a lot of Germans can kind of sympathize with this. Yeah. He's as much of a lockdown skeptic as you can become without being an outright fascist. Yeah. He's basically been saying, said that yes, we need to do this, but we also have companies, and we should make sure that people work, etc. So again, this is a reasonably popular position. He's not an extremist in any way. He's kind of a nice guy. He's a classic West German Rhinelander. I'm a Rhinelander, so I can this kind of guy I know quite well, and he hasn't got any big designs. He considers himself pro-Europeans, in the sense that many Germans consider themselves pro-Europeans. In a way, the Remainers in the UK consider themselves pro-Europeans, though this had very little to do with Europe. In the end, it's all about them and their kind of mindset and what they how they see things. But it's ultimately not a genuine. He's not we should not think that he would enter some integration agenda or fiscal union agenda. Right. That's not what he will do. He will always look after, like Merkel, he will look after German interests. The question is whether he will be as effective as she will be. That's not clear, but it will not be a fundamentally different agenda. So the only other candidate I could see emerging is Annalena Baerbock, the candidate of the Greens. Yeah. The Greens had been about 6 weeks ago, they were ahead in the polls. That's no longer the case. The CDU has kind of clawed back its the losses. But the CDU and Laschet's party, Merkel's party, is still down from their last result. They were about 35% last time, or no, actually 32%. And now they're about in the polling in the high 20s. So they are a little down. The Greens are doing well compared to last time. I mean, they only had 8.9% in the 2017 elections. And now they're polling between 20%. At one stage, they polled 30%. Yeah, so that's astonishing for a small German party that advocates an anti-industry policy. They advocate speed limits on autobahns. This is not something you do when you want to maximize the number of votes, but it's what they believe in.
Just quickly, Wolfgang, Angela Merkel is coming to London on Friday, is she not, to meet our Prime Minister Boris Johnson? No doubt there will be words said about the quarantine. How do you imagine that meeting's going to go?
I think Boris will probably say or make the point that it's an unreasonable discrimination, but he will obviously not tell her what to do in her own country, but he will try to explain to her that there is no bigger risk to be in the UK than to be in Germany, and that it is completely unreasonable to ban people who have a vaccination, given that the vaccination is relatively, seems to be successful from what we know. That seems to be unreasonable. They seem to, they will probably talk about Russia and China, that these will probably be foreign policy issues that they will need to talk about. I think Russia in particular is given the UK's own issues with Russia right now, the incident in the Baltic Sea, or whatever that was,
Yeah.
is clearly a concern. Obviously, the UK has had this issue with Russia, and the EU will need to have some kind of allies in it, so how it responds and how it stands up to Russia and China, and how it also confronts transatlantic relationships. So I think there's plenty for them to talk about. In the end, the EU, the vaccine decision is ultimately not between her and Johnson. It's ultimately between her and the other EU leaders and the health ministers who actually take the decision.
How do you expect, assuming Laschet does win the September elections, or is able to put together a coalition, how do you think the relationship will be with Macron, and how will that French-German axis play out? Do you think there'll be much change?
I mean, Laschet says of himself that he is sort of naturally closer to Macron than any other German politician, which I don't think is the case. I mean, first of all, Macron faces his own election, less than a year. And, while, one should not underestimate him. He had a disastrous local election, but, one should never underestimate. He's a skillful operator. It takes skill in a country like France to come from nowhere, build up a political movement, but get elected president. One should never underestimate a guy who pulls that one off. And, I personally don't like Macron very much. I think there's something, I kind of sympathize with his pro-Europeanism, which, I favor too, but there's something about the way he goes on about it. There's still sort of a certain, particular French flavor to this. This is very much based on French interests rather than. I don't think this European thing is very genuine. It's something I distrust. Ultimately, Macron and both Laschet will not be European builders. They will start from different ends, and Germany still has this interest, mainly industrial interest, and keeping this. Germany has a lot on its hands, so I don't think there will be a lot of scope for strategic leadership. And it's possible that if someone else becomes president, like Xavier Bertrand is a candidate, he did really well in the election. He's kind of the Laschet guy of French politics, so that might be sort of a closer relationship. I believe that Franco-German relationship is not as critical to the future of the EU as it was in the past. This is a time from a different era when the EU had 12 members or 9 members at one time. Then that relationship really mattered. Today, yes, it mattered for the recovery fund. It came into action then, but only in as much as Germany had to come on board for that. Yeah. Without Germany, it wouldn't have been possible. But for the fiscal union, this is not something that France and Germany can lead. This is something that has to actually happen. One would need a much, much broader consensus for that to emerge. I don't see it right now. And it takes a leadership, especially in Germany, from somebody who says, really, I put some political capital behind it. That Laschet is not that kind of guy. And I would not expect that to happen.
So where else could it come from, or do you think it'd be a much more played out, dispersed power with, more say from Spain, Italy?
Yeah, I don't think fiscal union will happen. I think we will see, I think the recovery fund will not become a permanent instrument, but it could become an occasional instrument. It might become a blueprint for other crises in the future. We're doing the math here. I mean, people always saying, it's a 750 billion fund, and then they compare a 6-year program, set it against 1 year's GDP to bloat up the figures. But if you do this if you do the math properly, just don't separate the loans from the grants, and you spread it out over the years and set it against each year's GDP, we come to a number of 0.3 to 0.4% of EU or Eurozone GDP. This is not, this is almost statistical noise, that numbers like that. This is not the big thing. No. At that order of magnitude, we could see this continuing in some sort of way. There will be future programs, and these are investment programs. The most useful thing for it to happen is if it were to trigger some economic reforms, say in Italy, which needs to undertake an awful lot of economic reforms, and if this became a kind of a sweetener, like a fiscal sweetener to pay for this stuff, that would be helpful. But the main impetus would be the economic reform. It wouldn't be the actual investment. So we would think, sorry?
Which they all need.
Yes, absolutely. That's a big thing. Italy's had virtually no productivity growth since they joined the Eurozone, so they need to generate that productivity growth. And the success or failure of that fund will be measured according to whether that will succeed or not. And if it is successful, and which is not certain, but if it is successful, they might do it again when there's another crisis. I mean, Europe is not short of crises, so the crisis will happen, and the justification will probably be one can make it. But a fiscal union is something different. A fiscal union would mean a European finance minister who can actually take decisions. It would mean tax raising powers. The EU doesn't have tax raising powers. It gets a share of certain taxes, but it doesn't have its own tax raising powers. These are things that need to happen, and these are deep constitutional things that would require shifts in the constitution of many member states, including and especially Germany.
Yeah, you made another interesting point in your article, Wolfgang, which is that during the last 15 years or so, Germany has actually not been investing in new technologies, which for such an industrial mercantilist country is essential to have the next wave. Why is that, do you think?
Germany has prioritized fiscal consolidation. There seems to be, every country has its, believes in certain economic theories, and Germans are very orthodox, economic thinkers. Not all of them, but there's a sort of predominance of sort of what they call ordo-liberal. This is sort of a, it's in some respects even more stringent than anything that you've heard from Milton Friedman and other conservative thinkers. And it is essentially, it doesn't help that in Germany the word guilt and debt are the same words. And so the word debt isn't sort of a financial instrument, but it has an emotional context, and you can't say anything good about debt in Germany. So there is a rule, a domestic rule, that you must not have debt, or that the maximum of debt per year is 0.35% of GDP, which again is a kind of a statistical rounding error. So for practical purposes, it means the governments operate without debt. That's the practical sort of translated into practical fiscal policy in the finance ministry, and that basically meant, and the only way in a complex country to achieve a goal like that is to let go of certain spending items. They were committed not to raise taxes. There has to be a certain redistributive element, because the CDU had been in a coalition with the Social Democrats, the German Labour Party, and they insisted on redistribution. So the only things they could all cut was investment into high-tech new technologies. And Germany was doing quite well, living off the fruits of its analog investments. They're kind of the high tech or the mid tech widget makers of the world, and very successfully. And they have some even today some very successful companies that produce screws for machines, stuff like that. But they have not had any successes in the digital era. All the big digital companies are American. They had some successes in biotech. I mean, BioNTech and Pfizer, that was a big hit. So did the UK with AstraZeneca and the Oxford vaccine. So Germany is a high tech. They have a lot of scientists. They spend a lot of, they've got good universities, and so they have the potential, but they didn't use that potential to turn this into sort of an industrial success. That's what they should have done. What should Germany do? What Merkel missed. She was not interested in this kind of stuff. She was not interested in laying any foundations in long-term strategic planning about long-term foreign policy positioning. I mean, Germany could have basically taken a lead in investment and taken a lead in building up a position against Russia and China and making themselves less dependent and become more powerful in their own right, not like America, but making sure that its interests are observed, and the EU's interests are not the same as Germany's interests. And the EU's interests are not only commercial interests; there are also political interests that have to do with European values, with civil liberties and things that are under threat elsewhere. And the EU has kind of missed the trick basically during those years then in which we all sort of scurried for very narrow advantages.
So they haven't developed maybe here, I live 20 minutes from Cambridge, extraordinary high-tech investment startups, Californians coming in, and you are in Oxford. So we've seen an extraordinary, so in a sense, you haven't had that dynamic new wave in Germany. Is that? Would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't exactly. I mean, Cambridge maybe. My experience of Oxford isn't quite as dynamic as yours of Cambridge, maybe.
No,
but
Cambridge is pretty hot.
the AstraZeneca and certainly the Oxford vaccine was a massive success, but also a surprising and maybe uncharacteristic success either for this place here. But in Germany didn't have anything like that. I mean, BioNTech was a success. They have their hits. That's for sure. A country that is so, it's a technical country. The people are engineers and they have good training. They all learn maths at school and sciences, so they are quite well educated for this thing. But this stuff needs investment, genuine money. It needs venture capital. It needs risk money, not just banks. What banks do, banks support companies that already exist, but banks don't support new upstarts. And Germany's had a problem with this sort of shift, just change of sort of tech, of the technology frontier that we basically living under, and that hasn't registered that. It's also not in the debate. It's all about cars and chemicals, and still people one gets a time warp. It's a very rich country. If you go into a sort of a mid-sized German city, it's wealthy. People seem content. Nobody is super rich. You don't have that. You have some old families that are still super rich. They were always super rich, but you don't have this sort of nouveau richness in Germany. That's sort of something that didn't happen. The incomes are well distributed between the minimum incomes are relatively high, standards of living are high, rents are low, so you can live in Germany even if you don't make much money. So you can have a decent life. It's probably easier to be on a low income in Germany than to be on a low income in the UK, for example. That is certainly the case. But it's sort of a sense of contentment, and there isn't this sort of sense of dynamic that you have in America. I mean, America is just unbelievably energetic by comparison. That is kind of lost on Germany, and it really came into its own during the sort of second industrial revolution. And where America really went full out for the digital world. And Germany is still, I mean, Merkel famously said, only 5 years ago, the internet is kind of a new territory for us. I mean, that was like 5 years ago when it wasn't new territory at all. And it's sort of still, German ministers are asking their offices not to forward any calls when they're driving, because when you drive through Germany, you often have no reception. There are huge gaps in the reception, and it's very embarrassing. It's very embarrassing if you're the economics minister and talk to the Commerce Secretary of the United States, and your phone basically cuts off. That's exactly the situation. There are kind of 4G free zones in Germany that are just incredibly large, and it's not that I know people living there. It's just they haven't invested. I do remember in the early 2000s when they auctioned off the 3G licenses. They prioritized revenue for the government, not coverage of the country. The view at the time was you don't need to have a reception at every farm in the country, which is exactly the place which needs receptions, because if you want exactly remote places need reception for mobile telephony. That's the whole idea of mobile telephony, that you can be reached remotely. It's not something you do for cities only. I mean, cities, you have different ways of communicating, but the countryside needs it. And lots of Germany isn't a countryside. There's a lot of small villages where a lot of industrial activity takes place, and which only recently got sort of optical fiber. There was a big sort of, people were queuing for that stuff.
Wow, so surprising. I think I might move to Germany, actually. So I rather like it.
Yes.
Anyway, Wolfgang, we could talk forever. I have final question. Who are you betting on for tonight's match? Or have you put evens on both? Have you covered yourself?
Well, I mean, I'm not the best football person for tonight's match. I'd say never bet against Germany. They are not a great team, but they have a sense of getting together. England is always it's as difficult for the Germans as Germany is difficult for the English one. For the English, it's not the kind of, when you ask the Germans who would you like to play, England would not be at the top of the list.
Okay.
It's sort of a candidate that an opponent that they fear, just the other way around too. It's sort of it should be interesting. Probably hopefully not as exciting as the France-Switzerland match last night.
Incredible,
which was absolutely incredible. And it's always sort of a sense of satisfaction if the underdog wins.
Yeah.
You know, I tend to be on the side of the underdog, but in this case, I don't know who the underdog is. So it's a hard one.
They're equally matched, perfectly equally matched. Let's hope it's a draw. I just love matches with lots of goals, actually. I know that's probably a very, but it makes...
Yeah, well, a draw means penalties in this kind of competition. There's no such thing as a draw, but absolutely, it will be another cliffhanger then.
Wolfgang, thank you so much. It's fascinating. We're going to talk forever, and I hope you'll join us again. So as we come up to the elections, you can explain why the Greens are going to win, or
or not.
or not. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And if you like what you listened to today, you can visit our website, and we have a 30-day free trial for new subscribers, and the link's in the description. So I hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.